December 16, 1944. At 5:30 in the morning, the forests of the Ardennes erupted in thunder. Artillery shells streaked across the frozen sky as German guns unleashed a devastating barrage against the unsuspecting American lines. SS Standartenführer Joachim Peiper's armored spearhead began to roll forward, engines growling in the mist, exhaust fumes mixing with the bitter smell of cordite. Inside one of the tanks, a young German officer scribbled in his logbook, wondering how they were supposed to spearhead an entire front with barely half the armored strength they were promised. That riddle would define the German gamble, a massive attack launched with dwindling fuel, overstrained logistics, and desperate hope that surprise might win what strength could not. In theory, this was to be a decisive blow. The plan, named Wacht am Rhein, envisioned a lightning strike through Belgium to seize Antwerp and split the Allied armies. Hitler believed that if his panzers could drive a wedge through the thin American lines, political shock would force the Western Allies to negotiate. On paper, more than 350 tanks and over 250 assault guns had been gathered for the offensive. In reality, mechanical failures, lack of spare parts, and shortages of fuel had already crippled many of them before the first shell fell. The Ardennes was chosen because it seemed the least likely place for a German attack. Dense forests, narrow roads, and steep valleys that would neutralize Allied air power. It was a brilliant plan in theory, yet one that demanded perfect timing and flawless coordination, two things the crumbling German war machine no longer possessed. The offensive began with an earth-shaking bombardment along an 80-mile front. More than 1,600 artillery pieces fired in unison, lighting up the pre-dawn sky. American units were caught off guard. Communications collapsed in the first minutes. The 12th Volksgrenadier Division surged forward through the mist, bayonets fixed, shouting, "Los! Los!" But the terrain was unforgiving. Peiper's armor, tasked with leading the breakthrough, quickly bogged down in chaos. Frozen roads jammed with columns of infantry, horse-drawn wagons, and fuel trucks. In some places, a single broken-down vehicle blocked hundreds behind it. Tempers flared over the radio as Peiper's men struggled to move through the dense fog and snow. It was supposed to be a lightning thrust. Instead, it became a slow, grinding crawl, 2 kilometers per hour through a nightmare of congestion. By the time Peiper's lead units reached Lanzerath late that night, nearly 16 hours had been lost. The entire timetable of the offensive was unraveling. Even small pockets of American resistance held up entire divisions. At the Losheim Gap, a mere platoon of U.S. reconnaissance troops delayed a full German regiment for hours. Every bridge, every crossroads, every minefield seemed to conspire against the attackers. Inside the tanks, crews sat in silence, their breath turning to frost. They could hear the distant echoes of gunfire, the thud of shells, and the groan of engines struggling against the cold. The forest was a maze of smoke and shadows. One officer described it as a column of hell made of men, machines, and fear. The next morning, as snow began to fall harder, Peiper's forces pushed on. Their orders were simple: advance at all costs. The plan called for his armored group to race west, capture fuel depots, and reach the Meuse River before the Americans could regroup. But the weather turned from ally to enemy. The blizzard that grounded Allied aircraft also froze German fuel lines and blinded drivers. Tanks slid off icy roads and into ditches. Radio messages crackled with reports of ambushes, mines, and unexpected resistance. The Americans, stunned at first, began to rally. At Elsenborn Ridge, their artillery batteries opened fire with precision, saturating the roads with shells. The German advance slowed to a crawl once again, trapped in the valleys and unable to maneuver. Peiper's column veered south, trying to bypass the ridge. He growled to his staff that the road ahead was fit, not for tanks, but for bicycles. Still, they pressed on, capturing Stavelot and Stoumont in fierce, close-quarter fighting. Houses were cleared room by room, grenades bouncing off walls, machine guns rattling through broken windows. Every victory came at a heavy cost. The roads behind them were littered with burned-out vehicles, frozen corpses, and shattered ammunition crates. Fuel had become more precious than gold. Each tank commander counted every liter, calculating how far they could go before their steel beasts became useless hulks. By December 19th, Piper's vanguard had reached the outskirts of Stoumont. His men seized the town, but their position was precarious. American reinforcements were converging from all directions, and the narrow road behind was cut off. Worse still, the massacre of 84 U.S. prisoners near Malmedy, committed by elements of his unit, had stiffened American resolve. From that moment, no one expected mercy on either side. The fighting turned brutal. German machine gunners froze to death at their posts, rifles clutched in stiff hands. The wounded were left in barns and cellars as medics struggled to keep up. Each night the temperature dropped below freezing, and each day the roar of American artillery came closer. By Christmas, Piper's remaining tanks were surrounded in the village of La Glaise. Out of more than 5,000 men who began the thrust, fewer than 1,000 were left combat-capable. Ammunition was nearly gone, fuel tanks were empty, and food had run out. They huddled in basements, listening to the walls tremble under the pounding of shells. Piper convened a meeting by candlelight with his officers. The decision was grim: destroy the heavy vehicles, abandon everything, and attempt to break out on foot. Each Tiger and Panther was set ablaze, their thick armor glowing orange as the flames consumed the machines. For men who had spent their lives inside those steel monsters, it felt like a funeral. In the early hours of December 24th, the breakout began. Snow whipped across the fields, visibility barely an arm's length. The men moved in silence, forming a human chain to cross an icy river. One officer later wrote that each man was pulled by the next stone by stone through the black water. They left behind their tanks, their wounded, and their dead. When dawn came, smoke rose from the burning armor scattered through La Glaise. Against all odds, around 800 men made it to the German lines 2 days later. Piper himself walked among them, silent and unshaven, his face carved with exhaustion. The Battle of the Bulge continued for another month, but the momentum was gone. The German offensive, once so daring, had bled itself dry. Fuel shortages, stubborn American defenses, and sheer logistical failure had doomed it from the start. By January 25, 1945, the front lines had returned almost exactly to where they started. Germany had lost tens of thousands of men and more than 500 armored vehicles. The last major offensive on the Western Front had ended in ruin. For the men who survived, the memories were burned into them as deeply as the frostbite scars on their skin. They had seen comrades frozen in their turrets, had felt the ground shake as their own machines were destroyed, had watched the dream of a final victory crumble beneath the snow. In the quiet that followed, there was no sense of triumph, only the dull realization that the war was truly lost. Looking back, it is clear that the Ardennes offensive was both brilliant and doomed. It was the final spark of a dying empire, a desperate attempt to turn back time. The Germans fought with courage, discipline, and skill, but courage could not overcome empty fuel tanks, blocked roads, and the sheer industrial might of the enemy. December 16, 1944 marked the beginning of the end. The forest that once echoed with the roar of engines and gunfire fell silent again, blanketed by snow and memory. And beneath that silence lay the truth of the war's final winter, a lesson carved in ice and iron. Even the strongest will cannot triumph when the machines that carry it run dry.